Okay, well then let's dive in on our lecture on the central nervous system, which we learned the divisions of the nervous system the other day. We learned that the central nervous system was made up of two structures, both of which are shown here in this picture. What are the two structures? Brain and spinal cord. Now, we already really kind of talked about gray and white matter, but we'll be continuing to talk about that here in this lecture and really into the next lecture. Spinal cord and our brain both consist of two types of matter, gray and white. Gray matter, we learned, has a relatively dull color, contains very little to no myelin, also appears gray because of the Nissl bodies, which impart that gray color. Nissl bodies is just a fancy term for the endoplasmic reticulum. This is the site of synaptic contact between neurons and therefore the site of all synaptic integration or information processing in our central nervous system. Remember, synaptic contact is what we were talking about towards the very end of Tuesday's class, where two neurons meet and we trigger the release of neurotransmitters, which cross the cleft, bind to receptors, and trigger the opening of channels that can then cause a depolarization and thus an action potential in what we call postsynaptic neuron. The gray matter, as it states, are the sites, or is the site of all synaptic integration or information processing in our central nervous system. This is where the really high level processing takes place. Okay. We mentioned the other day things about like the cerebral cortex, which is a very thin outer layer of our cerebrum. Okay. We said that that's made up of gray matter. We'll be talking more about the cerebral cortex here today. The gray matter in the cerebrum is on the outside. Gray matter in our spinal cord is on the inside, forming a kind of capital H shape. This is where you find the cell bodies of motor neurons and interneurons. White matter has a bright white appearance because of its abundance of myelin. It is composed of long bundles of axons called tracts, carrying signals up or down the spinal cord. We also have tracts in our brain. You know, it's not listed there as in that sentence. That carries signals up and down the brain, across the brain from one side to the other, and from like the front of the brain to the back of the brain. We'll talk more about those here later in this lecture. That last sentence there that states there's two types of tracts, sensory or ascending and motor or descending, really relates specifically to the spinal cord, because there's other types of tracts in our brain that we'll talk about. You can think of tracts like an elevator when it comes to the spinal cord. An elevator does two things, right? It goes up and it goes down. And signals go up the spinal cord by way of sensory or ascending tracts. They go but down by motor or descending tracts. Here's what a section of spinal cord looks like. Doesn't matter at this point where throughout the spinal cord it is. You can see that capital H-shaped gray matter in the center and the white matter on the outside. Okay, that's where the tracks are that I was just talking about. Let's talk about the gray matter, though, here on this slide. The capital H shape that exists for the gray matter involves what we call horns. We have what are called two dorsal horns. Dorsal, you'll also see them listed as posterior. Dorsal and posterior are interchangeable terms, are the horns on the backside of the spinal cord. And they receive impulses from afferent or sensory neurons, which are carrying signals in to our spinal cord for sensations, whether that's touch, itch, tickle, hot, cold, whatever. And that signal is coming in to the back of the spinal cord by way of a spinal nerve. And as we see just before arriving at the spinal cord, that singular spinal nerve forks. One half goes to the back of the spinal cord. That's where we synapse with our interneuron. The other half of the spinal nerve is going to go to the front of the spinal cord, and that's where signals leave. Because the ventral horn, ventral gray horn, also known as an anterior gray horn, is where you find the cell bodies. That's what this dot would be for what we call lower efferent or motor neuron, which are the neurons that carry signals out. to our skeletal muscles, causing them to contract. And now when a signal comes into the spinal cord, we can see it arcing like this in and then right back out. That's what we do like when we touch something hot, so that we immediately remove our hand from that hot object. But we also send information typically up the spinal cord into our brain, so that we have that conscious awareness of cold and hot and itch and tickle and that kind of stuff. Which means that we have to use the white matter as well. Sometimes we cross from one side of the spinal cord over to the other using what we call the gray commissure. Gray commissure is what this crossbar that connects the two vertical lines of our H to one another. In the center of that gray commissure is a central canal, which is a canal that contains cerebrospinal fluid that flows down from our brain. Okay. Only present between T1 and L1 vertebrae is another set of horns. These are what we call lateral horns. And that's where you find the cell bodies of autonomic motor neurons, which control things like our cardiac muscle in our heart, our smooth muscle in places like our intestines and the uterus and the bladder, and then glands. And remember, autonomic for automatic. Think about where T1 and L1 vertebrae are. That's your chest and to your upper back, or the upper part of your lower back, I should say. And right down smack dab in the middle of your torso, essentially. Well, think about all those organs that are located in that area. Most of those automatically controlled things like your stomach, intestines, heart, lungs, spleen, bladder, so on and so forth, right there by, which should make sense why we can carry that signal directly from the spinal cord to those from this area of the spinal cord. Now that's the structure, the gray matter in the spinal cord. We'll talk about the gray matter in the cerebrum and cerebellum later in this lecture when we talk about the cerebrum and cerebellum. White matter in our spinal cord, once again, forms the outside, and it surrounds that interior H formed by the gray matter. This is where you find the tracks carrying signals up and down. In other words, to and from the brain. Whereas in our brain, the white matter is located deep to the gray matter, both in the cerebrum and the cerebellum. This is the cerebrum, which is the largest part of our brain. We also have a cerebellum, the second largest, and its interior is also made up of white matter. We'll talk more about the brain and stuff later on in this lecture. The organization of our gray matter allows it to function as a reflex arc, and I've already used that term arc once here. This is where a sensory signal enters the spinal cord through the back side via the what we call posterior root of the spinal nerve, carrying a signal. Maybe it's that we're hot, maybe it's that we're cold, maybe it's pain. We carry that signal into the back of the spinal cord, into that posterior horn or dorsal horn, as we call it. We process it, which involves a interneuron, and then that triggers an action potential that goes out via a motor neuron from the front of the spinal cord out to our skeletal muscle. But with any sensation, more than likely we're going to have signals going up the spinal cord, which involves sensory or ascending tracts out in our white matter, which once again, think of the tracks of our spinal cord like a elevator carrying signals up, also carrying signals down. And we'll talk about reflex arcs next week in our next lecture, like touching something hot and removing your hand from it, which happens almost instantaneously, which is an involuntary reaction. It's a great thing that we have this. We don't have to think about, oh, ouch, that hurts, let's get my hand off of it. Okay, but for most contraction of skeletal muscles, that's a voluntary, purposeful thing that we do. And that signal originates back up in our brain, which means that we carry a signal down from our brain via motor or descending tracks. It's like our elevator going down. And then we carry that signal into the gray matter from the white matter, and then eventually up to the skeletal muscle. And now, if it's a autonomic reflex, so like when we're sweating or when we speed up our heart rate or something like that, things that we don't control and have typically no awareness of, we're going to carry a signal from an autonomic motor neuron out of the spinal cord, eventually to those effectors, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle glands, which we'll talk more about in our next lecture, which is all about somatic autonomic stuff. So one way our spinal cord promotes homeostasis is by propagating action potentials along tracks. The name of a tract often indicates its position in the white matter, where it begins and ends. And as you saw on the previous page, and I think here on the next page, white matter contains both sensory and motor tracts. Nerve impulses from sensory receptors propagate up our spinal cord, so we're talking about ascending tracts here, along two main routes. On each side, a spinothalamic tract and the posterior column. The spinothalamic tract conveys nerve impulses for sensing pain, warmth, coolness, itching, and tickling, whereas the posterior column actually has two smaller tracts. I'm not even going to try to pronounce those. But overall, what you'll want to know is what the posterior column conveys, which is sensations for touch, pressure, vibration, and kind of complicated sensation, what we call proprioception, which is involving information around our muscles, tendons, and joints, especially like position and the movement associated with those different things. So those are ascending tracts going up, associated with sensations. That's why we also call ascending tracts sensory tracts, as you see here on the previous page. This page is more about the downward carrying signals, so the descending or motor tracts, which we can all trace back to the cerebral cortex, something I've mentioned a couple of times already. The outer part of our brain, which plays a major role in controlling the precise voluntary muscular movements, like contraction of the muscles in your hand and arms to allow you to write these notes down. Other brain regions provide important integration for regulating autonomic movements. Once again, autonomic, think automatic. So, controlling your heart rate and blood pressure and stuff like that. Motor output to skeletal muscles travel down the spinal cord in two types of descending pathways, direct and indirect. The direct pathway, I'm not even going to list all those off. The one thing you want to take away is what they do. Convey nerve impulses originating in the cerebral cortex that are destined to cause, and the key word there is voluntary movements of our skeletal muscles. So when you write with your hand as you're contracting skeletal muscles in your arm, wrist, hand, fingers, you're using the direct pathway that originated back up in your cerebral cortex. The indirect pathway, I'm not going to list off of those, that's not important, but they convey nerve impulses from the brain stem, causing automatic movements, because although skeletal muscles controlled automatically, or voluntarily, there are some automatic aspects of skeletal muscles, like muscle tone, which is like if I had you guys lay down on the ground and I said, relax all your muscles, so it feels like you're not contracting anything. Even when your muscles are 100%, at least in your own personal mind, relaxed, they're still contracted. Maybe very, very fine contractions that are always going on. And muscle tone is that slight degree of contraction, unless you have a paralysis situation where the signal is cut off from the muscles. And posture is another one. We don't have to really kind of focus brain power on maintaining, our head in upright position, our spine in upright position. Postural muscles are pretty much controlled automatically for us. Same thing goes into balance and then orienting our head and body. Okay, really, this lecture says central nervous system, but for the most part, we're done talking about the spinal cord in this lecture. We'll pick it up with it more in the next lecture when we talk about like reflexes, like tapping the patellar tendon that we've talked about, flexor withdrawal reflex when you touch something hot or painful. That'll be next time. Okay. Really, the majority of what we talk about in this lecture, starting here, is our brain. Okay. We'll go through the parts of the brain, learning about what they do here in just a minute. But first, let's just talk about some just general things associated with the brain, which includes the flow of blood to it. Despite only representing about 2% of our total body weight, at rest like you guys are all in right now, in condition where you're not exercising, in other words, about 20% of the oxygen and glucose that we have in our bodies going to our brains. So consuming a lot of oxygen, glucose, which is important. Remember, we use oxygen to make ATP aerobically, which requires oxygen, but also glucose, two things that our brain doesn't create or store. That's why we have to have continuous blood supplies to our brain. And if we cut off blood supply to our brain, how long are we going to last? A couple minutes, right? We synthesize ATP in our neurons almost exclusively from glucose via reactions that use oxygen. In other words, what we're saying is aerobic cell respiration. Scientists realized this a long time ago, and they've actually used the way that the blood flows through the brain to kind of figure out what stuff does in the brain. For example, when activity of neurons in neuroglia increase in a region of the brain, blood flows to that area of the brain. So that's what they do. They kind of use that as a kind of way to figure out, oh yeah, your frontal lobe does this, because that's where the blood flow is going when you're doing this activity. Because virtually no glucose is stored in the brain and the reactions used to make ATP from glucose, the supply of glucose and oxygen to our brain must be continuous. Blood low in glucose entering the brain can cause mental confusion, dizziness, convulsions, even possible loss of consciousness. That's why being hypoglycemic can be very dangerous. Last time, or last, I guess it was probably not last time, but last week. No, we did talk about this on Tuesday. Talked about the supporting cells of the nervous system, what we call neuroglia, and we learned that a special type of cell called astrocytes create what's called the blood-brain barrier, BBB for short. As I said, it's exactly what it sounds like. It is a barrier between our blood and our brain, and it protects our brain cells, so those neurons in our brain, from harmful substances and pathogens that might be in our blood by preventing the passage of those from our blood into our brain tissue. Some things absolutely need to pass and easily pass through the blood-brain barrier. Things like glucose can do so by facilitated fusion, which means that they use those transport proteins that you see there in the picture. Other substances like creatinine, urea, most ions can do so, cross it very slowly. Creatinine and urea are actually waste products, so they would be going into the blood. Things that are lipid soluble like oxygen, carbon dioxide, steroid hormones, alcohol, barbiturates, nicotine, and caffeine, as well as water, can easily cross the blood-brain barrier, which explains, it should be common sense. We need to get oxygen to our neurons quickly, get the CO2 out of there quickly. Hormones, kind of the same thing. We need to, get them where they need to go. It also explains why alcohol can affect the way our brain works, and it doesn't take hours for alcohol to produce an effect. Anybody ever heard of drugs called barbiturates before? Yeah, they're not very commonly prescribed anymore. They were very popularly used a couple decades ago. so you don't see them very often. They got abused. There's a lot better drugs out there for anxiety and that kind of stuff. We all know what nicotine is, caffeine as well.
So how come it's just like barbiturates, not like narcotic opioids and stuff, or is?
I'm not 100% sure on how easily those cross. I just kind of list what was in the book, but I bet you could do some independent research and find out for us.
Like they had me on those patch things, and I was really wondering about how those really actually work.
I would assume, I
I was scared to take them wrong.
I would assume they have an easy way to get in your brain, and that's why they do what they do to us. But proteins, most antibiotic drugs actually do not pass from our blood into brain tissue. That looks like it's cut off a little bit at the top. It's cerebrospinal fluid, parentheses CSF. If you can't read it, or didn't already know it, I know you can't read it. But this is a clear, colorless liquid, protects our brain and spinal cord from chemicals and from chemical and physical injuries. We talked about epidermal cells the other day. That are the cells that create and circulate this. And helps to carry oxygen, glucose, and other needed chemicals from our blood to neurons and neuroglia. It circulates through cavities in our brain. We call those ventricles. And in the spinal cord, in that little central canal, that little opening in the middle of the H that I was mentioning earlier. Total volume of it is not very prominent, 80 to 150 mils, just 3 to 5 ounces. You know, I have a bottle of Dr. Pepper over here that's 20 ounces. So maybe a quarter of that is all we have for cerebrospinal fluid. What's in it in adults? Glucose, proteins, lactic acid, urea, cations, sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. You know, we talked about sodium and potassium a lot on Tuesday. Chloride, bicarbonate, that's what HCO3 is, also prevalent in there. We even find some white blood cells as well. 3 things cerebrospinal fluid does to contribute to homeostasis. It helps kind of serve as a shock absorbing medium because it kind of allows our brain and spinal cord to float in their respective cavities. So that's how it provides mechanical protection. So it helps protect against concussions, right? Did you guys know you can get concussions to your spinal cord as well? Now it's common, but that is a thing. Okay. More common, obviously, would be brain concussions. And, one of which, you know, happens when you like slam your head forward and the brain like slams into that front of your skull. Doesn't necessarily involve all the time just like a direct blow to the head. Chemical protection, it provides an optimal chemical environment for accurate neuronal signaling. Even slight changes in the ionic composition of cerebrospinal fluid can seriously disrupt AP. Remember, AP is short for action potential production. All that stuff that we talked about on Tuesday with the flow of sodium and potassium in and out of the neuron is super important, obviously, for every action potential. And as that states, cerebrospinal fluid helps keep those numbers of ions correct. And then we circulate nutrients and waste from our blood or between our blood and nervous tissue. Okay, let's start actually discussing what the brain does. Solving an equation, feeling hungry, laughing. The neural processes needed for each of these activities occurs in different regions of our brain. We can describe our brain as a portion of our central nervous system contained within the cranium. It's made up of about 85 billion neurons, which is an incredible number. Even more incredible is the number of neuroglia, 10 to 50 trillion of those. Considering how small it really is, only about 1,300 grams or 3 pounds in adults. We can describe it as a control center for registering sensations, correlating them with one another, and with stored information, making decisions, taking actions. It's also responsible for your intellect, emotions, behavior, memory, and I could go on and on and on. We have kind of 4 major divisions, each of which works to accomplish specific functions. We'll start at the bottom as we go through, beginning in the brainstem with the medulla, the pons, the midbrain. We'll talk about the cerebellum, which is kind of the part of the hindbrain, posterior to the brainstem. And then we'll talk about the diencephalon and the hypothalamus, epithalamus, thalamus. And then finally, the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain, which is what separates us from other animals because our cerebrum is so big and allows us to be such high-level functioning animals. Here's an illustration of it, sagittal view, so it's been cut in half. Not something I'm going to, focus on. We'll get to that in anatomy, though, for those of you who are taking that class. Don't worry about it at that point. Okay, like I said, we'll start at the bottom, work our way up. Beginning with the medulla oblongata, made famous by a movie that came out when I was probably in middle school, The Water Boy.
Yeah.
Starring Adam Sandler. Within the medulla, we have what are called nuclei. Okay, when you see the term nuclei, that's plural of nucleus. We all know what a nucleus is from our lecture on cells. Okay. When we talk about nucleus or nuclei in the brain, nucleus is a collection of the neuron cell bodies in our central nervous system. So last time we met, or actually it was 2 times ago, we learned about the structural makeup of a neuron. How it had a cell body where the kind of major organelles are, like the nucleus and the mitochondria and that kind of stuff. Well, remember, I just told you how many million neurons are in our brain, right? So these neurons aren't independent. I mean, you've got bunches of them together. And the parts of those neurons generally match together. So you've got a bundle of neurons, which means that the nucleus, or excuse me, the cell bodies will be together. A collection of several neurons and their cell bodies together is called a nucleus. So we'll use the term nuclei when we have a bunch of them, plural. Okay. And they are the components for the sensations of gustation, a fancy word for taste, audition, which is a fancy word for hearing, equilibrium, which is a fancy word for balance. Those are 3 out of our 5 special senses. We're just missing vision and smell, okay? So your medulla is involved with those very important special senses. Also contains nuclei associated with general senses of touch, pressure, vibration, and there's that conscious proprioception I was kind of talking about earlier. Cranial nerves are associated with the medulla. Now we'll get into the cranial nerves at the end of the lecture. There are 12 pairs of these that are attached to the bottom of the brain. We number the cranial nerves from 1 to 12 using Roman numerals. So cranial nerves, looks like 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are attached to the bottom of the medulla. The last little bit there really kind of is one of the, or probably the most important things that our medulla does, regulating primitive, visceral, and somatic functions, especially the first 3 bullets at the bottom. Our medulla can be described as the major regulator of our cardiovascular system. And our cardiovascular system is composed of 3 things: your heart, your blood vessels, and then the blood that's inside of those 2 things. We regulate our heart rate thanks to the cardiac center within the medulla. Not only the rate at which we beat our heart, but also how strong of a beat it is. What we call, excuse me, it's contractility, how hard a beat is. The vasomotor center of our medulla regulates blood vessel diameter, which is how we regulate things like our blood pressure, but also helps to route blood flow to specific parts of our body. Like when we exercise, We talked about this the other day, how we kind of shut off blood flow to our stomach, and we route it to things that need it, like our skeletal muscles. And so your medulla is involved with that. Your medulla also has what's called the medullary rhythmicity area, or you could just say medulla rhythm area if you wanted to think of it that way, which is the portion that regulates our rhythm of breathing, how fast or slow we breathe. Those three things are absolutely essential for living every second of every day, right? Because we need our heart to beat, we need our blood to flow, we need to breathe that oxygen in and that CO2 out. So those are absolutely essential functions of the medulla. Our medulla is also involved with kind of less important things, but still important. Vomiting, swallowing, sneezing, coughing, and hiccuping. Very primitive things, but very important in their own right. Something else that our medulla does, very cool, thanks to these structures called pyramids, we decussate. And I'll talk about that. I'll let you finish writing. Okay, looking at the picture at the bottom, this is a transverse section and anterior surface view of the medulla oblongata. We see the kind of front of that picture what we call pyramids, which you can see are labeled there. Bulges on the anterior aspect of the medulla formed by large corticospinal tracts passing from our cerebrum down to the spinal cord. It was mentioned early in our lecture, so that's why I said, remember, I didn't actually even read it off, but corticospinal tracts control voluntary movement of our limbs and our trunk. So signals that come down from our cortex can cause us to like wave our hand or walk, meaning we contract our leg muscles. Those signals are traveling through these structures, the pyramids. When they do so, look right here what they do. They decussate or they cross over. And so signals from the left side of our brain actually end up on the right side of our body, which explains why if I wave my right hand, that signal is actually originating in the left side of my brain, and vice versa. Not every signal, but about 90% of the axons in our left pyramid cross to the right and 90% from the right to the left. We'll get into that later in the lecture. Now that's for signals coming down. We see the same thing for both descending and ascending. So signals going up also cross over as well. Make sense? Did you guys know that your right brain controls your left body? Vice versa? Yeah, so like if somebody has a stroke and they lose feeling on one side of their body, and they can't move like their left arm, we're going to check the right side of the brain. If you didn't know, now you do. All right, your pons. The word pons actually means bridge, which is what this structure does. It's a bridge that connects the different parts of our brain with one another. It has white matter, including tracts conducting signals from the cerebrum down to the cerebellum and medulla, and tracts that carry signals up to the thalamus. So there's sensory tracts, motor tracts, there's also nuclei. The cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8 are associated with it, integrating the autonomic reflexes associated with those. Like I said, we'll talk about these cranial nerves and specifically what they do later on this lecture. Probably the most important thing to highlight or star would be that second bullet. It contains nuclei of what we call the pneumotaxic and abductic areas. Collectively, they help create the respiratory center. which along with our medulla help control breathing. Now we'll talk about specifically what these things do for breathing when we talk about breathing. So when we get to the respiratory system later on the semester. It contains vestibular nuclei, components of the equilibrium pathway from our inner ear to the brain. So helps maintain balance. Signals for voluntary movements from motor areas of our cerebral cortex are relayed through nuclei in the pons to the cerebellum. Once again, describing how it's a bridge connecting different parts of the brain with one another. Above or superior to your pons is what we call the midbrain, also known as the mesencephalon, which connects our pons to the diencephalon. Your midbrain has bundles of axons in the anterior part called cerebral peduncles, which are axons of motor tracts conducting nerve impulses from the cerebral cortex down to the spinal cord, pons, and medulla. So it's kind of like a bridge in its own right as well. It's connecting parts of the brain with one another. As far as its kind of most important functions, it's going to help control our awareness of pain. And I'm going to make a statement that's going to sound really super weird, but pain is a really good thing. Why would I say that?
Because it tells us that our senses are working.
Tells us our sensors are working, yes.
Something's wrong.
Tells us something's wrong. Okay, because tissues are being damaged, we've got something wrong. Okay, think about putting your hand on a hot stove, which we've used, and what would happen if you don't feel that pain?
Just melt your hand.
You would melt your hand. Okay? So pain is a good thing. You might not agree with that at the time that you're experiencing it, but it is a good thing. Midbrain does a lot with vision, helps with visual attention, like tracking moving objects. Like if I were to throw a pin at you or something like that, you'll be able to track it, hopefully catch it, and not let it hit you in the face. If you blink, that's a visual reflex thanks to your midbrain focusing, so like for near vision versus far vision. Dilating, constricting your pupils for changes in light intensity, turning your eyes and head in response to visual stimulus, like in the corner of your eyes. Auditory reflexes, like your startle reflex, that could cause you to jump like that when you have a loud noise, a very important protective mechanism, so that if there's a dangerous situation or something's coming at you, you can react and you're not taken too much unguarded. I've never actually got anybody to jump quite like that before, so it worked out really well. Red nuclei are sites of synapses between axons from the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex that help control some voluntary movement of limbs. And cranial nerves 3 and 4 are associated with the midbrain as well.
So that's where the visual and auditory sensations are at?
So, I mean, some of which they travel through. We don't process what we see and that kind of stuff. That takes place in the cerebral cortex, but signals travel through different parts of our brain, like the midbrain, on their way to our cerebral cortex. A little bit more on the midbrain. What we call the substantia nigra is one of the nuclei in our midbrain that releases dopamine, which we learned is a neurotransmitter involved with subconscious control of body movements. And at the end of Tuesday, we talked about Parkinson's disease and how we, if we have that disease, lose kind of voluntary control of our skeletal muscle, and therefore what we end up with are just involuntary muscle contractions. Like I said the other day, Michael J. Fox, kind of the most well-known person that, I think he was in his 40s, like I said the other day, he was really young. Most of the time it doesn't affect people until they're 60. No, he's still trucking. It's unfortunate we know what causes it. There's just not really great ways to prevent it, stop it. Actually, I saw a video cannabis was actually a really good treatment for it. So I won't get into any of that debate or anything like that, whether that is something we should be using, but
Something that works.
it is. Of course, you could go across the river now, get a medical card.
Missouri?
Missouri.
My brother moved to Colorado because he was legal there, and he has schizophrenia, and then he had to, I've got one that's got like Asperger's, and one that's got schizophrenia and other mental issues, and that's how they treat it, and it works a lot better than
Yep.
medications we have here.
Fortunately, there's still a lot of stigma against it. There's a lot of things it helps with. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that. Let's talk about the reticular formation. If I go back to this picture, it's not something that you're going to be able to just pinpoint out because the reticular formation is a small cluster of gray matter interspersed or kind of like sprinkled in within the white matter of places like our brainstem, spinal cord, diencephalon, and cerebellum. So it's kind of this purple area in the picture on the next page. The part that I want to talk about the most here is its RAS, the reticular activating system, which consists of sensory axons projecting to the cerebral cortex. That's actually what's shown on the next page. Responsible for many, many things. Possibly the most important function is consciousness, which is described as a state of wakefulness in which an individual is fully alert, aware, and oriented. Something that I hope all students are experiencing as I teach. Unfortunately, I understand, especially after lunch, I always struggled with staying awake in class despite even enjoying what I was learning. And sleep involves inactivation of the RAS. Defining sleep, it's a state of partial consciousness, and the key here is that an individual can be aroused, which arousal is just waking up, and your RAS is involved with that. Whereas damage to the RAS causes a coma, a state of unconsciousness in which an individual cannot be aroused. So you can't toss water on them, you can't shake them, they're not going to just wake up. And now, when we wake up, it can be because, light, or we've had enough sleep. We'll talk about our timekeeping hormone and our biological clock, sleep-wake cycle stuff. You could be asleep, and if Jordan was asleep a couple minutes ago, when I clapped my hands, I would have woken her up. We know one sensation that we will not have that wakes us up.
No.
No.
Well,
So
wait.
like, what about like if your house is on fire?
Why do we have smoke detectors?
Oh, okay.
We
What
don't
about-
smell smoke.
What about the military sniffing salt things?
They use that, yeah, to wake you up.
That is a good question. I don't know exactly what goes into that, but I think that's more of a chemical that
Chemical
Yeah, I was about to
reaction.
say, it's probably
That's
chemicals
something
in there.
specific to us. But
Well, the fourth one, we knocked it out. Smelling that.
that's another different thing.
So wait, what was it coming from a coma?
I don't know.
And like.
Many factors
On
probably.
that same subject, like for sleep disorders, like I have a sleep disorder, I have to take medication to keep me awake. I mean, is it because I don't have enough of that?
I don't know. You could probably many things.
Maybe it affects.
Unfortunately, I don't know all the answers. I wish I did. All right, other things your RAS does. It helps maintain attention, concentration on a single object thought, alertness, prevents sensory overload by filtering out unimportant sensory information, something that I always joke guys have too much of, which explains why we are not very good at listening to the things that our wives or girlfriends say. Feel like you're really focused on something. I've been teaching this same slide before, and I've had a truck drive by with their jake brake on as they were making that big noise. And then I asked the students how many of them heard it, and nobody said anything because nobody heard it, despite that it was happening 10 feet from behind them. Wasn't here, was in Highland. But that made me so excited that they were actually paying attention to me and were avoiding that unimportant sensory information. And then I've already talked about muscle tone, slight degrees of involuntary contraction in our normal resting skeletal muscles. Okay, your cerebellum is the largest part of your hindbrain, second largest portion of your brain behind the cerebrum. I wish these two structures were named differently because cerebrum and cerebellum are spelled very similar. They can therefore be easily confused. Okay, there's a lot of similarities. We haven't talked about the cerebrum yet, but we will, between your cerebrum and your cerebellum. First of all, both of them involve two what we call hemispheres, okay, two halves essentially, a left and a right. In this case, cerebellar hemisphere, connected by a bridge called the vermis. We don't have a bridge that connects. Well, we kind of do, but I won't talk about that yet. Both cerebrum and cerebellum have those hemispheres subdivided into lobes. Okay, your cerebellum has what we call anterior and posterior lobes, which govern subconscious aspects of skeletal muscle movements. And I can't ever pronounce that, so I just call it the F lobe, which is on the inferior surface, contributes to equilibrium and balance. Three pairs of cerebellar peduncles connect our cerebellum to the brainstem. These are bundles of white matter with axons conducting impulses between the cerebellum and other parts of the brain. Overall, what they do is contribute to coordinating movement, regulating posture and balance. So as you guys can see, I've already mentioned things like movements, balance, equilibrium, posture. Overall, the primary function, and I would highlight this, to evaluate how well movements initiated by motor areas in the cerebrum are actually being carried out. So when I wave my hand, when you guys contract your arm muscles as you take your notes, those signals are not actually being sent down from your cerebellum. Your cerebrum is where those signals are coming from. But our cerebellum is also involved in that process. And I always think of the cerebellum kind of like human resources, in that it's making sure things are getting done correctly. If you've ever worked in a job that had human resources department, you know what I'm talking about. When movements initiated by the cerebral motor areas are not being carried out correctly, our cerebellum detects those discrepancies. We then send feedback signals to motor areas of our cortex via its connection to the thalamus. And that feedback signal then helps correct the errors, smooth movements, and coordinate complex sequences of skeletal muscle contractions. We also think possibly, at least the textbook, which means that scientists do, that it regulates posture and balance and makes possible all skilled muscular activities, from catching a ball to dancing to speaking. And we might think that it plays a role in cognition, which is the acquisition of knowledge, and language processing. So kind of some different things, but very important nonetheless. The next area of the brain is called your thalamus, but you can see I listed off its nickname, which is something you're going to want to know. What we call the gateway to the cerebral cortex. Your thalamus is a pair of oval-shaped masses of gray matter perched at the superior end of our brainstem, just beneath the two cerebral hemispheres. We call it the gateway to the cerebral cortex because of the first bullet. What it does is it's the major relay station for sensory impulses, at least most sensory impulses, that ultimately reach the primary sensor areas of our cerebral cortex from our spinal cord and brainstem. Next week, when we move into our lecture on sensations, and we're talking about vision and touch and hearing and itch and tickle. Those sensations get processed in our cerebral cortex, which means that they're being carried to the cerebral cortex. Before they get to the cerebral cortex, they take a pit stop. That pit stop is in your thalamus. So your thalamus is obviously very involved with sensations. It's also involved with motor functions by transmitting information from our cerebellum and basal ganglia to the primary motor area of our cerebral cortex. It relays nerve impulses between different areas of the cerebrum, plays a role in the maintenance of consciousness, which we were just talking about earlier, being fully alert and aware. And then we'll talk more about the thalamus when we talk about the emotional brain, because it plays a role in emotions, as well as things like memory, learning, cognition, sensory information, auditory impulses, visual impulses, arousal. What's olfaction? Smell.
Doesn't it like secrete important chemicals too?
Everything. I mean, they're all neurotransmitter chemicals. Unless we're talking about hormones, which the hypothalamus secretes. Yes, every part of our brain, all neurons secrete neurotransmitters, those chemicals where two neurons meet. We talked about that a little bit toward the end of last time. All right, your hypothalamus is a portion of our brain that you guys are going to get pretty tired of hearing about, because this segment of our brain is going to control just about any and everything we talk about from here on out. It is the major regulator, as it states there, of our autonomic nervous system. So anything that's controlled automatically for us can thank your hypothalamus. It's also the major regulator of your endocrine system, which we haven't talked about, but we learned your endocrine system back in Unit 1, along with the nervous system, are the two systems in charge of everything. We'll talk about the endocrine system in our next unit. And since it's a regulator of the endocrine system, it secretes hormones, which you can see listed right there. These hormones that it secretes affect and control the anterior pituitary gland, the gland that hangs down from the hypothalamus. What it does is it releases hormones that then tells the anterior pituitary to either release or stop releasing hormones. And in doing so, it helps regulate things like growth, metabolism, reproduction, and stress responses. It also produces two hormones that are carried from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary, which is the other half or so of the pituitary gland. And it regulates, as a response, things like our water balance by either making us pee more or less water out. It controls blood pressure in doing so as well. And we've talked about oxytocin before. Do you guys remember what oxytocin was involved with? Childbirth. That's the hormone that causes contraction of the uterus. Oxytocin is made by the hypothalamus and released to the posterior pituitary. We'll get into that more next unit. As I said, anything automatically controlled involving the autonomic nervous system, things like heart rate, blood pressure, GI secretion, motility, among many other things, you can thank your hypothalamus. Now, just a second ago, I said the major regulator of your heart rate, your blood pressure was your medulla, right? Remember me saying that? Well, now I'm saying hypothalamus is actually in charge. That's because your medulla is more like number 2. I know you guys all work. This structure is like the boss, like the manager. And you can think of the medulla like the assistant manager, which is told what to do and is the one that actually gets to do it, right? Or if you're like number 3 in command, you're the one that actually gets to do it. Because that's how it works in a lot of jobs. Boss's boss tells the boss what to do, and the boss turns around and tells you what to do. I'm sure you've all experienced something like that. We've been talking about body temperature in this class, shivering, sweating. We can describe our hypothalamus as our thermostat. That tells us when we should shiver, when we should sweat, when we should do other things to help regulate our body temperature. It monitors our blood sugar and our water balance and makes us hungry if our blood sugar is low. If our water levels are low, it makes us thirsty. So it's very involved with food and water intake. It sets your circadian rhythms, which are your biological clock, sleep-wake cycle stuff, 24-hour repetitive cycle that we experience every day. It is involved with memory because it lies in the pathway of signals traveling from the hippocampus to the thalamus. Hippocampus is an important memory center of our brain. And then it's a component of our emotional brain, contributing to things like anger, aggression, fear, pleasure, contentment, sexual drive, and even orgasm as well. Closely associated with your thalamus is the epithalamus. And the major structure that is part of our epithalamus is called the pineal gland. Now, this is a gland within the brain that secretes a hormone called melatonin, our timekeeping hormone. Do not confuse melatonin with melanin. What's melanin do? Skin tone, hair color, eye color, that kind of stuff. Or pigmenting in our skin. Melatonin is our hormone that you can actually buy over the counter to put you to sleep. Melatonin puts us to sleep. We secrete more of it at night. And that's because of things that I'll get into when we talk about hormones more. So that's what this is. Now, circadian rhythms are more than just your sleep-wake cycle. Another term for circadian rhythms would be biological clock. But you hear that term like when somebody's describing like, oh, I'm 30, that means I need to start having kids. Yeah. That's not what I'm talking about. This is a 24-hour repetitive cycle, fluctuations in temperature, fluctuations in hormones. Sleep-wake is just part of that. Okay. But it's a very important aspect of it as well. Well, I just said a second ago that the hypothalamus was in charge of circadian rhythms. Well, guess what? Hypothalamus, remember, is the manager. He's in charge of the hypothalamus. These nuclei in the hypothalamus regulate the secretion of that melatonin by the pineal gland. Okay, parts of our diencephalon called CVO, circumventricular organs, because they lie in the wall of the third ventricle, a chamber within our brain, monitor chemical change in our blood because they lack a blood-brain barrier. This includes parts of the hypothalamus, pineal gland, pituitary, and a few nearby structures. What's important is what they do. They coordinate homeostatic activities of our endocrine and nervous systems, things like blood pressure, fluid balance, hunger, and thirst. Also, an interesting factoid is that they are thought to be the sites of entry of brain into the brain of the virus HIV, which can lead to dementia and other neurological disorders.
You notice the word ventricle in there? I thought that was part of your heart.
There are ventricles in our heart. We also have ventricles in our brain. In our brain, the ventricles are the chambers where that cerebrospinal fluid is at. Very small little chambers that we have. But you weren't wrong. Ventricles in our heart are chambers that pump blood. Okay, finally, we are at the point in our lecture where we get to talk about the cerebrum, the largest 80% of our brain, uppermost division, made up of two halves, the right and left cerebral hemisphere. And like I said earlier, this is what separates us from other animals because ours is so big, complicated, provides us with the ability to read, to write, speak, all those things. especially the first two, reading and writing, we can do, but other animals cannot. Other animals can speak, sure, but they don't sing. And that's another thing. I mean, that separates us, think of it that way. Composing music, making calculations, remembering the past, planning for the future, imagining things that have never existed before. I always kind of just compare people to dogs. And we have a dog in our house. She's butthead, but she's our dog. You know, she's got really kind of two things on the mind: comfy place to lay and treats. She's not composing music, planning for the future, remembering the past, those kinds of things. 4 parts to each cerebral hemisphere exists, and they're named for the bones that they are deep to. So you have 2 frontal lobes, you've got 2 hemispheres, 2 parietals, 2 occipitals, and then a temporal on each side. If you take a segment out, you can see the very thin outer cerebral cortex, only 2 to 4 millimeters thick, and is the gray matter, which is mostly responsible for those fancy things that I was just mentioning. Now, to increase the amount of cortex we have, you see the surface of the cerebrum is folded, has these rolls and depressions. The folds or rolls, whatever you want to call them, are called gyri, which the singular form of that is gyrus. You can see one of them is labeled right there. Can't probably read it very well, but that's what it says. The little tiny depressions, so it's like peaks and valleys. The little depressions are called sulci, or sulcus, I've heard them pronounced that way. Sulci is plural, sulcus is singular. Okay. Some places we have fissures, which are like greater depressions. In this case, the longitudinal fissure is the one that separates the 2 hemispheres. There is a 5th part of the cerebrum. It's called the insula. As it says in parentheses, you probably can't read it. It says projected to surface. And that's because it's deep to those other lobes. So that's why it's kind of shown here in a transparent way. You actually have to kind of pull parts of the brain off to see it. But it's an internal lobe to each side of the cerebrum. We're going to talk about the cerebral cortex quite a bit here on this page. Before I do, there's a special sulcus I want to talk about. It's one of the very few sulcuses. Remember, a sulcus is a depression. This is really more anatomy based, but your central sulcus is this line that's going across between the frontal lobe and the the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Okay. Just in front of that central sulcus is what's called a precentral gyrus. Just behind that is a postcentral gyrus. Those are anatomical points that are very important because of what I'm going to talk about on this page. Functional areas of our cortex. So let me read through. Specific types of sensory motor and integrative signals are processed in certain regions of our cerebral cortex known as functional areas. Generally, sensory areas receive sensory information and are involved in perception, which we know is the conscious awareness of a sensation. So what that kind of sentence means is there's different areas of that cerebral cortex dedicated to things where like vision goes, where hearing sensations go, where touch goes, where smell goes, okay? And those things are all mapped out on this page. There's also motor areas of our cerebral cortex which control the execution of voluntary movements. Yes, you're kind of close. There's also association areas that deal with much more complex integrated functions like memory, emotions, reasoning, will, judgment, your personality traits, and intelligence. There are so many different functional areas listed in your textbook. It's like 2 or 3 pages, I think, if I remember right. It's been a while since I've looked through it. I've chosen something like 10 that I'm going to focus on that I want you to know. Not so much where they're at, and I didn't even include that, just what they are responsible for. The first of which is the primary somatosensory area, which is where nerve impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, itch, tickle, temperature, pain, and proprioception sensations go. If I go back to this previous page, this post-central gyrus, right there behind the central sulcus, that's where those sensations are going. Primary sensory area, or excuse me, primary area of the supracortex, for what we call our somatostatic sensations. These are all somatostatic sensations coming from the skin, muscles, tendons, or joints. And that general area is shown here in blue in our picture on the next page. Right on the other side of that central sulcus is the what we call primary motor cortex, or primary motor area is what it says here. That's where signals go, or start, I should say, that cause eventually contraction of specific muscles or muscle groups. So that's why I pointed out the central sulcus, because something very important takes place here and here. The precentral gyrus is where those original signals start that allow you to do any muscle movements, to walk and jump and run and write and that kind of stuff. The other ones, they're all pretty, hopefully, common sense. Primary visual area is associated with visual perception. You guys are using that right now as you're looking. It's where those signals are going from the retina of your eye. Primary auditory area is where sound is perceived. So auditory perception, you're using that one right now as well. As you're hearing the sound I'm making as I speak. You use your gustatory area when you were eating your food or when you're drinking whatever it is you're drinking, which is involved with taste or gustatory perception. Olfactory, we said olfaction is a sense of smell, so that's where olfactory perception takes place. A couple special ones, I already talked about this one, so I'll skip to the Broca speech area. I'm using that because I'm articulating and speaking, found most often in the left hemisphere. Wernicke's area is what's interpreting the meaning of speech by recognizing spoken words, which you guys are using as you recognize what I'm saying, hopefully recognizing what I'm saying. Facial recognition area, I was kind of think this one's kind of cool. It's going to store information about faces, which is very difficult right now with these masks on, but it allows you to recognize people by their faces. I remember when I took psychology, I believe we were talking about this part of the brain and how people can have damage to this. And when they look at people, they can't really see faces anymore. It's just like a blob of just like gray. That's what they describe it as. So it's kind of cool. Obviously, people's faces are still there, but they have no ability to see and process it anymore. Auditory association areas where you recognize particular sounds as speech, music, or noise. So that allows you to understand that I'm speaking words and then I'm not just want, and I'm not singing. You can tell those things apart. And then your prefrontal cortex is a very big area, right deep to your forehead. And that's where your personality, your intellect, complex learning abilities, the recalling of information, initiative, judgment, foresight, your reasoning, conscience, intuition, mood, planning for the future, and development of abstract ideas. So really that's kind of what separates each of us from one another and how we're all different personality-wise and everything else. Unfortunately, based on its location, it's also a common site of injury because your forehead is pretty easy to damage, like in a car accident and hit your head on the dash. And I remember when I took psychology, as I stated again, people can have a traumatic brain injury to their prefrontal cortex and have a complete personality change. They might be the nicest person before and then the biggest butthead after.
So if I get somebody that's a real a-hole with a can in the front of their head, maybe they'll be nice later.
It might happen. I don't take my word for it, but I guess it's possible.
For legal reasons, he does not condone.
Yeah, that's where they used to do lobotomies
Yikes.
Right through your eye.
right through the, yeah, or the, up through the nose. And yep. Obviously, they don't do that kind of stuff anymore. Nor do they do something I'll talk about on this page.
Oh, is this gonna be electric?
No.
That's just never worked. Not really. Has it? I don't know. That's very cool.
All right, so that was just the very thin outer shell of our brain, which leaves us with the white matter still to discuss. So beneath that surface of cerebral cortex, we have composed mostly of white matter, numerous tracts, which once again are myelinated axons. There's 3 types in our brain or in our cerebrum specifically, whereas we only had 2 in our spinal cord, ascending, descending. We do have some that carry signals up and down our cerebrum and connect to those ascending, descending tracts, our elevator in our spinal cord. That's what projection tracts are. Shown here in green, I guess that's kind of a green color, extending vertically between higher and lower brain and spinal cord centers, thus carrying information between the cerebrum to lower parts of the CNS. In other words, thalamus, brainstem, spinal cord, or lower parts of the CNS to the cerebrum, meaning signals are going up. Okay. If you look hard enough in our bottom picture there, we even see where those signals are crossing over, decassating in our medulla, as we talked about earlier. Commissural tracts are shown here in both images. Not so much in the top image, that's a sagittal section, but we do see a structure form from our commissural tract, what we call the corpus callosum. Commissural tracts connect the 2 hemispheres and thus allow signals to cross from one side to the other, which I always tell students, remember cross, which begins with a C, as does the word commissural, and the structure that's formed by called the corpus callosum, which if you turn your page sideways, even looks like a C. This is the connection between the 2 sides of the brain. And I believe Jennifer was asking earlier about left brain, right brain. A lot of the research that was done to describe that actually was done when they cut through that corpus callosum and thus severed the connection between the 2 sides of the brain, which is a very big no-no anymore. Same thing with like lobotomies as we were talking. Association tracts connect different gyri within the same cerebral hemisphere. In other words, they allow signals to like go from the front of the cerebrum to the back of the cerebrum, or vice versa. And those are the ones that are shown up here in red in our picture. So that was white matter. We have gray matter again to discuss. So this is like in the very innermost part of our cerebrum. 3 masses of nuclei. Remember nuclei, we said earlier, gray matter, cell body collections of neurons. We call these the basal nuclei. Now the term, and actually I saw it labeled this way still earlier in the lecture. Instead of calling it basal nuclei, we call it basal ganglia. Nuclei and ganglia are similar, except ganglia refers to cell body collections outside the CNS. Nuclei is inside, so it really doesn't make sense to call it basal ganglia, although you'll still see it that way a lot of times. The basal nuclei structures include what's called the globus pallidus, putamen, and caudate nucleus. Not that that's super important. What is important is what it does. And I even say right there, basal ganglia help initiate and terminate movements. So getting started moving, stopping moving, suppress unwanted movements, and regulating that thing called muscle tone that we've mentioned several times. All right, the limbic system is a ring of cerebral cortex, so it's another ring of gray matter. This time it's really, really centralized. I don't know. Yeah, I don't have a picture of it. At the floor of the cerebrum, or the border of the cerebrum, and the floor of the diencephalon. So it's like super, super in the middle of the brain. Includes many things. Collectively, we call our limbic system our emotional brain, as it governs emotional aspects of behavior, things like pleasure, pain, docility, affection, fear, and anger. You know, we talked earlier about how like the hypothalamus was involved with those things. There are portions of your hypothalamus that are listed here. You can even see the thalamus is listed here. The mammillary bodies are listed there, are part of the hypothalamus. So these collectively we can kind of describe as our primitive brain. Going back to talking about like dogs and other animals, which don't plan for the future, don't compose music and read and write and that kind of stuff. That's really, this is what governs their life. What they're all about are their emotions. And we use our emotions to make decisions. Hopefully we don't make every decision based on emotion. We think clearly and plan for the future and those kinds of things. But we're not making a decision based on belly rubs and treats and those kind of things like dogs and that kind of stuff. Your limbic system is also involved with olfaction, once again, is smell and memory, specifically because it's involved with the hippocampus, an important memory center, and other parts of the cerebrum, which includes the thalamus that I mentioned earlier. Okay, we've already kind of talked about right brain, left brain stuff. That stuff is collectively called hemispheric lateralization. So reading through, although the brain, and we're talking the cerebrum mainly here, is almost symmetrical on its right and left sides, there are subtle anatomical physiological differences between the two hemispheres. Although the two hemispheres share performance of many functions, each hemisphere also specializes in performing certain unique things. Property we call hemispheric lateralization. And I'm sure most of you have heard, the terms right brain, left brain. I mean, you've heard it already today, but prior to today, I imagine you've heard it before. Right hemisphere functions are listed there on the left side of our table. Things like music and artistic awareness, space and pattern perception, emotional content and language, stuff like that. Over there on the right side of the page, left hemisphere, a lot of the kind of more empirical reasoning, scientific numerical skills, spoken written language. I was told by a psychology teacher that actually she's retired now, but she obviously knows a lot about this stuff. Actually, a lot of research is stating that this might not actually be the case. That it might not be as big of a right brain, left brain thing as they used to think. Since our textbook still teaches this way, I'm going to go ahead and teach it this way. You just know maybe in the future they're not going to use terms like right brain, left brain to describe these things. What you do want to know, though, for sure, is the table, because there will be questions, probably at least maybe just one, but I might say, like, which of the following is a right brain function? Or which of the following is a left brain function?
Aphasia.
Aphasia?
Aphasia.
Aphasia? Oh. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on it. It's hard. I know what it is, it's just kind of hard to explain. Let me see if I can just do it real quick for you. Aphasia. Yeah, so it's your ability, robs you of your ability to communicate, ability to speak, write, understand the language, both verbal and written. So. Okay, now that we have a general idea of what all the different parts of our brain do, kind of summarize some of the most important things our cerebrum does. Talk about integration. We've used that word a lot this semester, all the way back to our first lecture. In this case, this is the processing of sensory information by analyzing, storing it, making decisions for various responses. It's all back to feedback, maintaining homeostasis. Integrated functions of our cerebrum include wakefulness, sleep, language, emotions, motivation, learning, and memory. Talked about some of these, a decent amount today. Like sleep, we said, is a state of unconsciousness from in which an individual can be aroused by stimuli. Adults typically spend about 8 hours a day sleeping, some more, some less, which means that sleep consumes about a third of our lives. Now, I could get into sleep in much more greater detail. We just don't have the time. You can take like a psychology class and you can learn a lot more about this. If you haven't taken a psych class, really should. It's really cool, especially if any of this stuff excites you, interests you. 2 phases to normal sleep exist: non-rapid eye movement in REM, and then REM, rapid eye movement, which can be, these can be broken down into, greater detail. They're called those because if you've ever seen somebody sleeping and they look like they're blinking all bunch, that's the rapid eye movement, which is when you're in your deepest sleep. It's also said to be when you're dreaming. Okay. Language is the way that humans communicate with one another, system of vocal sounds and symbols that convey information, and most commonly it is spoken and or written. Emotions are subjective feelings that you have about your own sense of well-being when a particular situation arises. And when we have emotions, we also have physical responses. Like, you might sweat, or you might change your heart rate, blood pressure, your breathing, digestion. Lauren, you were talking about when you get stressed, your skin dries out and that kind of stuff. Sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot like that, but these are just demonstrations in how a brain process affects a physical thing. And also we have smiling, as you were doing, as I said your name, even though I can't see your mouth through your mask. Frowning, running, jumping, any type of movement involving skeletal muscle contractions. Motivation is an internal process directing an individual's behavior toward a particular goal. Many of those motivated behaviors start with a need, anything that individual deems necessary to have. Learning, ability to acquire new information or skills through instruction or experience. 2 main categories of learning: associative and non-associative. Associative occurs when a connection is made between 2 stimuli. Non-associative occurs when repeated exposure to a single stimulus causes a change in behavior. Like if you get shocked every time you grab something, you're going to stop grabbing it, right? It's how you can teach animals that aren't as smart as we are. Memory is the process by which information acquired through learning is stored and retrieved. Okay, we're going to stop here. It's 1:30. We got just a couple more slides, 2 slides left. So I'll just record these 2 slides and post them. You can watch them over the weekend. And we'll pick up with our new lecture on Tuesday.
This is the one we used to do.
That'll be for Tuesday.